Everyone. Thank you so much for joining us early this morning. And a bigger thanks to our panelists and our moderator for making it. We are extremely thrilled to have you on board. I would like to provide some short introductions of our panelists and our moderator before we hand the session over to Deva sir. First off, we have Usha Ramanathan. Dr. Usha Ramanathan works on the jurisprudence of law, poverty, and rights. She researches in rights and speaks on issues that include the nature of law, Bhopal gas tragedy, mass displacement, eminent domain, manual scavenging, civil liberties, including the death penalty, beggary, criminal law, custodial institutions, the environment, judicial processes. She has been tracking and engaging with the UID project and has written and debated extensively on issues of technology and the human conditions of freedom and liberty over the years. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, ma'am. We also have with us Professor P.K. Shahjahan. He is a professor of social work and Dean Academic Affairs at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. He was formerly the Dean Social Protection, Dean Student Affairs, Chairperson, Center of Community Organization and Development Practice, and Chairperson of South Asia Study Center for Studies in Conflicts, Peace, and Human Securities at TISS. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us. And finally, we also have Mr. Sunil Lulla.
Good morning.
Close to 4 decades, Mr. Sunil Lulla has been actively involved in building brands and growing businesses, startups and turnarounds across media, digital, music, advertising, audience management, and the FMCG space. He has held leadership roles across many companies, which include Broadcast Audience Research Council, Balaji Telefilms Limited, Grey Group India, Times Television Network, India.com, Sony Entertainment, JWT, HMV, and MTV. Thank you so much, sir, for being with us.
Pleasure.
And we also have with us our moderator, Professor Deva Prasad M, who is a faculty member in the Humanities and Liberal Arts section of IMK. Thank you so much, sir, for moderating this session. And now over to you.
Thank you. So I hope I'm audible to all of you. Just to quickly check.
Yes, sir, you are. Yes, you are.
Video part. Right. So we have a very stellar panel today, which going to touch upon the topic of technology as a driver for social equality. So quickly putting the context of the session, we are witnessing increasing reliance upon technology for service delivery by government and creation of digital platforms by business organizations are also being witnessed. So while our lives are deeply linked with technology, certain pertinent questions do arise from social equality perspective, especially issues of accessibility to technology. Professor Usha has worked extensively on that aspect, especially on the UID project. Then the issue of digital divide, whether it impacts business organizations and how business organizations do deal with it. Then obviously the social equality issue, what are the basic issues that comes into picture in the context? That is also something which we need to look into for our sessions discussion purpose. So straight away coming to the questions, because there's been clear request that we need to keep the panel timing tight from the panelists. So straight away coming to the questions, I'll start with Professor Shahjahan. So can you please explain, based on your broad expertise in this area of social equality and social equality aspect of people's participation in the various government service delivery as well as various projects, what are the broad challenges in tackling inequality in India? Are we improving or going backwards?
Thank you, Professor Deva, for giving me this opportunity and for the student community to organize such a wonderful, very, very timely conference. And very privileged to be with Dr. Usha Ramanathan and Mr. Sunil Lulla for this session. Coming to the question, I think what we essentially need to understand is that technology needs to be seen as an enabler. And technology is not a solution in itself. So keeping that in mind, something which we need to be very, very clear about is that, as we grow, the wealth is increasing. More wealthier could be seen as healthier, as Biggs in one of his literature has talked about. Wealthier is indeed healthier, but how much healthier depends on how increase in wealth is distributed. So the question of distribution in terms of wealth, knowledge, and technology is going to be a key for taking the technology as a driver for development. To elaborate a little more on this, if you look at the kind of situations in which the technologies have been used and the technologies have been accessed, it definitely has a divide which exists in the society. The technological divide we talk about, or digital divide we talk about. Unless and until we essentially tap on that technology divide and remove the technology divide, the digital, digital opportunity which we are talking about could lead to digital poverty, and that digital poverty could lead to absolute poverty. So when technology is being taken as a facilitator for development dispensation, and if that technology is not accessible to the larger number of people, and this divide, technological divide or the digital divide, could actually lead to digital poverty and thereby leading to larger. So there is an opportunity, huge opportunities are being explored. At the same time, there is a special emphasis need to be brought in for reducing inequality in terms of access to technology. That's the opening remark I would like to make. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for that interesting input. I think we'll come back to you to take forward that initial discussion point. So I'll just have a question for Dr. Usha Ramanathan. So you have extensive experience of researching upon the service delivery part of governance by government projects. How does the government use a service to actually dole out the various government schemes? And one of the important contribution from your side obviously has been the UID project research you have done on that, as well as the privacy law research which you have done. So what is your experience when you look at the government's use of technology, and how it has been an instrument to enable higher use of technology in service delivery, whether it has been a major success, and what are the ground level implications that you can share with us?
If I can take off from where Professor Shahjahan was speaking, I'll just include my work on law and poverty and bring it into this. See, there are three phenomena that we had noticed over time, that we've been researching over time. One is of dispensability. There is this idea that certain skills are dispensable, certain classes of people are dispensable. When you look at our country through the economy, for instance, you'll find that certain people are completely dispensable. Very closely related is the idea of redundancy, and that we find especially in relation to the workforce. And the third is this notion of invisibilizing, where through various processes, people get invisibilized. It's not that they are invisible, but sometimes they are too. But there is an active process of invisibilizing. And when we study it through the law, we can see the various places where they fall into various holes from where they can't be seen. And this is not like, it's not something that just happens. It is also made to happen. When technology comes in, the expectation when you say that it is going to be inclusive is that it will deal with this aspect of invisibilizing, and that it will not increase dispensability and redundancy. We find that simply has not happened. Part of the reason is because technology is provided as a solution without knowing what the problem is. So areas are picked up and they are used to explain why the technology should be rolled out. So something that was promised to be a solution becomes a barrier. So and that's how we start off with saying that the whole UID project, for instance, was started saying that this is for the poor. that the poor don't have identities and therefore they are not able to access what the state has to offer. And the solution therefore was providing an ID. Like the ID would help them access the state. But we must remember that this is a project that was started with untested technology. Biometrics, for instance, is untested, and biometrics is being most used and most expected from the poorest in this country. So if you can't identify yourself through that, then there is no way you're going to be able to get access to the services to which you're entitled. But it is not only biometrics. It is like Jean Drèze had written in an article recently, you lose your UID. You're expected to keep this closer to you than you'll keep anything else in your life. Because without it, what you suffer is civil death. There is nothing you can access if you don't have this. And as a person who doesn't have a mobile phone, and as a person who's growing older, I can tell you that every time, you need, if I were in that position and I had to access services, when my biometric changes, the only way that I can update my biometrics is if I can get an OTP to a registered mobile phone, which I do not have. So we are expecting in this country not just that people should come and enroll themselves in the system, but they should equip themselves in ways, for instance, every person owning a mobile phone, which they will keep through the years and make sure that that is the process through which they are going to get, their continued identity. It's also true that mobile phone has become the best way of tracking people and of surveilling people. So it's like technologies are being created without any respect for the way in which human beings have found their way to rights. And the poorer you are, the more the burden that is placed on you. So today you'll find that they say we save so much money by using this kind of ID system. But when you look closely at how you're saving it, it's by dropping a lot of people off who are unable to get onto the system. So what then are we saying? So I could go on about this for a long time, but I think I've broadly made the point about the idea, the distinction between inclusion and exclusion being forgotten when what you want is just that technology should take over. And one last word, which is that, we need to learn to listen carefully, and we've all learned to do that, and still we miss many things. One of those is that a long time ago, they shifted from UID being an ID for people to becoming infrastructure and for data to become the public good. And that infrastructure will produce the data. And then this is going to be the new resource on which our economy is going to be based. People's personal information is now a resource that the state says it wants, and the corporates, the technology companies say they want, so that they can convert it into economic growth. Let's just think about that also while we are thinking about the rest.
So very important remarks on the fact that how invisibilization happens, and I think that adds on to what Professor Shah Jahan has pointed out regarding the digital divide and digital poverty concept that comes in the picture. Along with that, it's important to actually look at this question of how do we actually move forward as a society with creating large data banks, especially from the perspective of public data, and whether the public good definition, how do we actually going to define the public good definition of the data? I think something which we'll revisit. I'll come back to Dr. Usha. So quickly to take the conversation forward, Mrs. Sunil, with your extensive experience of almost 4 decades in business sector, and that too spanning across various business sectors, EduTech, I think you have worked with EduTech startups, you have worked with FMCG space, media. Almost, I think you can actually help us to start the question from a business angle. In your experience, how do social inequalities manifest in business? How can technology be an important level or what you could call as a solution in this particular context?
So before I respond directly to you, I think there's a lot of hype built around technology. Okay, what has happened is we have a mobile phone. Half the country has a mobile phone. please understand half the country does not have a mobile phone. And that is the problem. There was a time when 95% of the country didn't have a landline. Right? So we feel that march from that 5% having a phone to 50% having a phone is big. What has the phone done? The phone has allowed you to communicate. Okay, and bulk of it is communication. Okay, the OTP monopoly has a good side that, at least a secure transaction. But I agree with Dr. Ramanathan's point of view. If you don't have a phone, you're stuck. Your OTP is going nowhere. It's lost in orbit. So let's understand, businesses in India actually have not adopted technology well. If businesses did, we would not be feeding the IT businesses across the world. We'll be building the IT businesses for ourselves. So we've never innovated around technology. Manufacturing in India is still operating in a rudimentary fashion. Distribution of food is still disproportionately unequal. Education is an embarrassment. Because technology tools, like we're talking today, classes are on Zoom because of COVID, but all of this used to happen around the world many years back. Doordarshan used to run classes in 1966 on education. Let's not forget that. So, this has become a poster boy because it's driving the stock markets, it's driving the VC firms. Let's understand the real role of technology. The real role of technology was to create social equality. Now, what does social equality mean? Everybody can learn to read, write, study, earn their living, and be able to contribute to the economy in some fashion or the other. Yes, there have been some really good things that have happened. Now, whether the distribution of money, I can send money to you, whether you can, I can get my vaccination, etc. over there, those are all more recent. I think more than technology, we should be very conscious that in 2020, the hero is not technology. It has been COVID, unfortunately, because COVID actually brought everything together. Right? If there was no COVID, I can guarantee you we won't be having this conversation in this fashion today. So let's understand, we must take the fundamental principles of what technology is supposed to do. It is supposed to drive innovation. It is supposed to create equality. It is supposed to create, if not equality, possibility of equality, right? It is supposed to uplift what we call the bottom of the pyramid. We should not really have a bottom of the pyramid. India now at 75 years cannot still be, delighted about the fact that we've got a fat bottom pyramid. It's a tragedy, if you ask me. So I think Indian business has failed with technology. Yes, Y2K, because of Y2K, we service the US, Europe markets extremely well. But which Indian firm is good with technology in India for its own self? So we are taking a few innovations, we're making a big noise about it. And I echo the sentiment that actually there's a draconian thing. Everything that I do now is known. You won't allow a WhatsApp chat in a court, but if I do it, you will hang me in media and many other places. And you will want to know what I chatted. So where is the justification about anything that is happening over here? I think the good point is, Professor Deva, is that there's an opportunity for us to wake up and for us to redefine the purpose of technology in India and put it central to our theme and to drive it, that we can actually take the entire Indian market up, the demography up. I have to go to a booth to vote. Why should I? If technology exists, I should be able to vote from my phone, right? If you agree with that, right? At least half the country can do so, no? If the other half can't. So I think we must take this opportunity to understand. And I think very importantly is first frame the rules and the laws. Then decide the footprint going forward, not the other way around. Keep the footprint is going in this particular angle, so let's frame the laws around that footprint. So first frame the rules and laws. Even today on content, something that is very close to my heart, there is no regulation. Okay, so you can argue democracy, freedom of speech, all of that. But what has happened, there is significant abuse. Whereas if somebody writes something which is hateful, it is the same phone which is viraling it out, right? And then you decide what judgment you want to have on this. So I think technology has to become something that is discussed in parliament every day, in companies every day, and rules are framed around the development of technology to grow India, right? And I'm not talking of Indian businesses. I'm talking of Indians, the 1.2 billion Indians.
That's a great input.
Just one second, Professor. I think there's something on the chat which says people cannot hear us. Okay.
Okay.
No, no, sir, that's been resolved. No problem.
Okay.
I think
It's just one person.
Thanks.
Solved, right? Okay, fine. Sunilji, actually, sorry to interrupt. I think you want to conclude your.
No, it's okay.
Fine. So that's great. Important factors that's being highlighted. One important aspect is that innovation. How Indian industry or Indian business or India as such, how we are actually looking at innovation around technology, whether we are leveraging it or not. That's an important factor that's being mentioned about. And plus the regulatory gap of whether the rules, law, policies, how are actually our institutions, whether we have grappled with the need for having clear regulations being set in place. So quickly to take the discussion forward, I'll come back to Professor Shah Jahan. So when we talk about innovation, as Sunilji has actually pointed out, innovation becomes a major problem, right? So how do you look at from a social innovation perspective, as we actually talk about technology? Is technology as widely used to enable people, especially from a social innovation perspective, and does it make social innovation easier across the world? And what is the Indian experience on that?
Yes, Professor Deva, I completely concur with what Sunil has mentioned about, and also the kind of tragedies which technologies can bring in, provided the technological reach is limited. I'll take you a very small example of the COVID vaccination. Let us look at that COVID vaccination case. It's a huge technological, swiftness with which we have developed vaccines quickly and rolled it out, and we were expecting that people will be vaccinated with this. Now look at the reach of this. When I was tracking the COVID equity dashboard of World Health Organization, I found a graph which shows that the low-income countries, the vaccination rollout is extremely low, and on the graph on the x-axis almost touching the x-axis, whereas the high-income countries are up there almost reaching 70% vaccination. We have a technology, we have a solution, we have an innovation, and India is having a good leadership in that. And of course, India has moved vaccine to many other countries, of less developed countries. Now, this moving ahead with this again about the vaccine access, high-income countries, almost 65% of the people are already vaccinated. Whereas if you look at the low-income countries, only 6.48% is vaccinated. This is a tragedy. This is a tragedy of the sorts. And look at, if a country needs to vaccinate its full population, the high-income countries need to deploy 0.8% additional income, additional expenses for additional investment for vaccinating the full population. Whereas the low-income countries have to increase their healthcare expenditure by 56.6%. This is World Health Organization data, which is recent. Now, the question which I am coming back to is that how do we address inequality in all of these things? If we do not address inequality, there could be many innovations. Social innovations are expected to be, bringing new solutions to the existing age-old problems or new ways of handling issues. How did we handle this inequality? How did we handle this inequality in COVID vaccination? And when you don't have vaccination, you have a longer period of lockdown. A longer period of lockdown means longer time of people staying away from work. And who are the people who are going to stay away from work? The casual laborers and the people who are not in the formal, so-called formal sector, who cannot have work from home possibilities. So this is a vicious cycle. So as Mr. Sunil was talking about, address the problem first, identify the issue. And Dr. Usha Ramanathan was also talking about, without knowing the problem, we actually get into a solution. Now, unless and until this huge inequality is being addressed, we won't be able to move forward with any kind of social innovation which we are talking about. Just take the example, I think Dr. Usha Ramanathan has worked tremendously on this. The manual scavenging work, or people who are getting down into the drain to clean. Why do we need to do that in today's world of technology? Why do we want to do that? Why do people, die in the drains, in cleaning the drains? Do we need to do that today? If we are bringing technology, are we going to replace people from that? No, in this we are not. But we going for automation, we going for artificial intelligence, machine learning and things like that. We displace large number of people. So we selectively use technology for the benefit of probably certain political reasons, as well as obviously for some economic reasons as well. So unless and until when we have a demographic dividend, the demographic dividend can become a demographic disaster if you do not have access to technology for people when you move into a larger technological frame for finding solutions for developmental challenges. So this demographic dividend, if we need to cash in on, we need to have a policy where people are included in the process. The social innovation, some of the work which I do on social innovation is looking at people-centered social innovation. It cannot be technology-centered social innovation. It has to be people-centered social innovation, where people are at the center of all these technological innovations and social innovations. So I think the question comes back to addressing inequality and identify the problem where it is in terms of access. 50% of the people Mr. Sunil was talking about, 50% of people do not have mobile technology. Forget about laptops and tablets for learning and various other kind of things which you need to do. I just stopped this with one small example which government of Maharashtra, particularly Pune district, what they are doing. In fact, they have it's happening all over Maharashtra. They have something called Mahalabharti website. What is being done is that you do BPL survey, you do a whole lot of data collecting data from people for various purposes. And when you search on something on your mobile, next day 10 products of that sort will come on your mobile as promotions. Why can't that be done for welfare provisioning? Mahalabharti scheme is trying to do that. When you log in with all your parameters and all the schemes which are eligible, you are eligible for, will be listed against you. Why do you want to apply for the scheme? You are collecting a whole lot of data. Collect the data, and the system will tell you which are the schemes you are eligible. You just need to click. Of course, again, the reach of technology and everything need to be there. They are looking at solutions by citizen facilitation centers and things like that. But when the technology and machine learning and artificial intelligence can all do good for the market, why can't it do good for the people through these kind of schemes? I think we need to do a lot of innovation in making sure that the technology is owned by people and available for people, accessible for people.
So very important points here is to actually look at how accessible as well as people's participation is being also looked at when you look at technology. And it's a very striking example of the innovation of vaccine and how we are actually facing vaccine inequality or vaccine equity challenge, which we all are facing. I think it's an important aspect, especially the global south, global north divide in that particular context. Now, I think actually I'll come back to Dr. Usha. So when we actually talking about innovations, we actually had Professor Shahjahan also mentioning about the fact that you look at social innovations and you need to actually look at technology not as selectively use of technology. We don't want selective use of technology. So when we talk about not having selective use of technology and need to look at more from a policy perspective, can I actually ask you to share your thoughts on the fact of how do we need governments to formulate any technology-led initiatives? What should be the parameters they should be mindful about? Any specific suggestions from your experience for Indian context? How do we actually look at technology-led initiatives for both business as well as both for service delivery in the government context?
Okay, so I think we started well by saying that technology is only an enabler. and technology is not a solution. It's also that technology oughtn't to be taking over people's lives. Technology should not be producing structures of power that are not wise for a people. For instance, this extraordinary amount of centralization that the current use of technology produces is really dangerous. It's a very bad idea. And sometimes I wonder, when we have governments and when we have governments and we have a government in the center now who are really worried all the time about national security, how is it that we think it's all right to create these multiple databases, and these multiple databases are linked one to the other in various ways? I mean, are we really expecting that it's all right for the granular data about a whole population to be accessible to anyone, anywhere in the world? I mean, how does this even measure up when we think in terms? I mean, we are actually telling anybody who's able to get onto the system, and like someone said, you can't say electronic and use security and safety in the same sentence. It just doesn't work. You have to be prepared for, and everywhere around the world we are seeing that hacking happens, things get taken over and you don't even know about it for a very long time. So why would we think it's all right that the vulnerabilities of our people, the possibilities of our people, every person and in every place, do you eat, how much food do you eat, and how many health problems do you have, and do you have to travel and migrate to do your work? Everything being known, it's not just the government that knows it. I think it's a problem that anybody knows so much about anybody else. It's, privacy is not some kind of, they say, oh, in this country, we don't care about privacy because we tell everybody everything that we have. We don't. There are many things that we do not tell everybody, and we do not want it known, and it's not wise to have it known. So why are we dropping this wisdom altogether? So the idea of innovation, unfortunately, in this country has not been what it needed to be. Innovation here has been talked about as something that should be free of rules, because only then we can produce the kind of technological innovation, I suppose, that you find, say, with Facebook or Google or whoever. We know today that the Facebooks and Googles are our problem, and yet we are running behind the problem, trying to catch up, saying, don't make rules, let's create all these products, and after that we'll figure out what kind of rules we need. We are, using you take the e-vision document of the Supreme Court. It doesn't deal with it doesn't understand what the problem is at all. It's saying you can refashion the way in which you work with Supreme Court and the judicial system to fit into technology. Technology has these products. There are certain places that we want to go in. Just read that document. The document is only about how those who are promoting the technology want the judicial system to be restructured to fit the technology. So what I'm saying so far is what we do not do. The other kind of thing that has been pushed, and it's how the language has changed, but the approach is the same, is to say that we had trickle down, which was a failure. Today we need to have trickle up. That is, data will trickle up. And the way it is said also is that in the West, in the developed world, there is wealth that has already come before data has become accessible. So they say in this country, we don't have wealth. And like Professor Shah Jahan was saying, I mean, we are talking inequality. There is no wealth, and there's wealth only among a few. So all the others, what are they going to bring to the market? So they say what they have is personal data, personal information. That will trickle up, and then you'll create innovative products on those. So it's a kind of thing where the word formal economy was used, that the formalization of the economy. Actually, as people lose jobs, as people get more insecure, as uncertainty is increasing, we are saying formalization is happening. We need to understand what that means, because the idea of formalization today is that we'll be able to track money movements. That makes it formalization. People have to get on to GST, otherwise they can't do any kind of business at all. That is formalization. If you can't be on that, you can't be in any kind of business. You'll create a social security code where you'll say every person who is, who doesn't have who's not already on the EPFO will have to get onto the get onto the database. And what does the rest of it say? It says you get onto it whenever we are going to provide anything. If you are not on this database, you won't get it. So you better come and stay on this database. And then they tell employers, when you have vacancies in your company, why don't you also put that on a database? But we will not bind you to take people from this database of workers. So it just then becomes a government and corporate entities knowing the people, and the people getting more and more, finding the government and the corporates more and more obscure. Because the operation happens on, it's not just a digital divide. It is also a one-way screen. And so I've not found anything so far in this service delivery. When they first started with digitization, there were many people who said that's fine. Because if you digitize, if it makes it more efficient, it's fine. But from digitization, you move on to linking an ID with it. Then you link an ID with it, then you convert them into data. When you convert them into data, you say, this is the property. Your data is the property of the corporate entity or of the government department. You actually have it said that the property in this transfers. And I'll just end with saying one thing. There is, I often used to think that, what is this economics? I mean, this discipline should just disappear. And then I found some economists who have actually introduced the idea of moral philosophy into economics. And that's Daniel Hausman and McPherson. And it was interesting to read, because one of the things that they say in introducing moral philosophy into economics is that there are certain things that cannot go onto the market. For instance, organs should not enter the market. It's not to say there should be no organ transplantation. It is that it shouldn't become, it's not a marketable product, because you lose something basic in humanity when you do that. Similarly, when I read what that says, it is very plain that personal information can never become something that enters the market. Throughout the time that the Shri Krishna committee was working, we kept telling them, it is not about property in data that we are talking about. We are talking about data as a personal right. In our country, we say, you cannot waive your fundamental rights. Even if I don't want it, I may not use it, but I cannot waive it and let somebody else make hay with that. So some basic, what is happening with technology now, I find, is at the beginning of the century, there was a lot of excitement about technology. Internet had come, it was really exciting. Everybody was walking around with a mobile phone. I mean, it kind of disabled people because one hand was only for the mobile phone and you have to use the other hand for everything else. But there was an excitement. And it's a shame that in the past 10 years, 10, 12 years, that excitement has converted itself into an anxiety. So for the poor, already they had vulnerabilities. We always talk about impoverishment and induced vulnerability. Now an additional factor has been added of uncertainty. If I'm able to link, then maybe I can get. Every month I have to go and see, we were just talking to some people who work on the right to food, and they were saying, no, it's a little better now, because if there is a family of 5 people, then at least one of them may have one finger that works for them to go. And so it may be a 9-year-old child who's going to school. One day in a month, the child is asked not to go to school so that she can go and collect the rations and come, because only that fingerprint works. Now, this is the kind of uncertainty we are introducing. So in this context, I find that it's very hard to talk about the positives of technology in this sector, because it's breaking people up into uncertainties. The first stage of digitization was actually helpful. What has been loaded onto it layer upon layer has taken away even that help that digitization offered. It helps people who are controlling the system. It's not, there is no, just think think about, there's not even a feedback loop. If you go to a place and you find that your fingerprint is not working, or you've forgotten your number, or it's not working for whatever reason, there is no feedback loop, or you're not able to enroll at all. There is no feedback loop. And that makes me think that it is because it is not about providing services to the poor. It's about seeing what can be derived from it for somebody else who's interested in something else.
So that's a pertinent point of what is a moral limit of market coming into picture. I think it's a moral limit of market being highlighted when you look at the data-driven economy. I think that's what Dr. Usha is pointing us to. And I think it's also the factor of the human values as well as dehumanizing many times the experience people go through when you actually look at being a part of it, as in just being treated as a part of a database or the personal data being used only for that purpose. So I think that actually is an interesting point, which I would like to ask Sunilji. How do you actually look at from a business perspective? We are actually witnessing emergence of platform-based business models. Lot of talk on digital economy coming into picture. Is technology being used to create equal platforms? Is the social realities being addressed, or is it being looked at by the business organizations or corporate organizations in this context? Can you actually share your experience around this question, and also any examples which you can share on that regard?
The basic definition of business is based on capitalism, and capitalism looks for rate of return. It does not look for rate of return on social metrics, right? So you cannot expect that business will suddenly have a golden heart. There can be a golden heart in some businesses, but you cannot expect because of that nature. But can business do what it can do to expand to what, say, Professor Shahjahan and Dr. Ramanathan said? And have they done their role in that? Yes, the Swiggies of the world have enabled many a homemaker to redistribute her skills by providing food to many homes as home-cooked meals. Okay, that's happening to people who have the access, have the affordability, and are getting a convenience to eat perhaps healthier and better food. It has enabled sustainability for some restaurants, especially during the COVID period when life was going the way it is. But we have this flag for Skill India. Which business you know of has said, I have 5,000 workers, I'm going to lay off 500, I'm going to reskill them basis technology. Let's start with the number 0, because that's the only right number. So let's understand this really clearly, that on the one hand, the VC capital of this country is growing rich, and every time that's happening, there are millions of people growing poor. There is no money going back. There are some exceptions, like one gentleman called Azim Premji, right? And there may be many like that, but there are a few, and they are not poster boys, because that's the nature of their acts that they do. I think for business in India, let's look at farming in India. We do really small plot farming. We are not like Canada, Australia, United States, which are large farms, large plots. The only place where things came together in a big way is Amul. Amul did not deploy technology, it deployed human capital. And I'm not saying human capital is not good, it's extremely good, right? Today, yes, because of better processing or better distribution, Amul is the brand and the business that it is. And we are becoming sufficient on the spectrum of milk and milk-based products. But if we have so much wastage in our warehousing of grains, why is ITC Chopal not playing a bigger role in redistribution of the same? Why is Unilever, which is such a big distribution company, not able to do that? So I just think that business and social causes and the government, they don't talk to each other. Because one of the big things you could do was actually to say that, look, yes, I see a big role in the Jio and the Airtel of changing India, right? In terms of connecting people. And thank you for doing that. Now, what are we going to do to get the next 500 million going? Because that will be the first big thing that happens. And when you do that, please do it respectfully in light of the constitution, because now you will want to control 1 billion, 1.2 billion people's mindsets. Okay, and that's not the case. That should never happen. So I think business has a very large role to play in actually looking at technology and looking at social equilibrium. Because if those 250 million, and I'm just taking a small number, 250 million at the right or the bottom of the pyramid, move up 10% only, 10% only. The companies that will get rich are Hindustan Lever, is Reliance, is Tata, and many, many banks, including state-run banks. So actually getting I think like everybody is saying, first get wealthy. You know, data is not wealth. Data is private information. This is complete, and especially this for the students of IIM, that's really important. You guys are going to shape the next 50 years of this country. And please go out there with a social conscience to understand really what you can do. Data is not for misuse. It's a person's private information. And that should not be the currency. The currency has to be, can I get people into an equal base? Can I think of jobs which will use technology so there will be 100 million people successfully employed, not in digging roads, not in cleaning up the sewage, even if it's in agriculture, we still don't generate enough power, right? Water goes in the sea and we fight about it and we do nothing to harness it. Yes, farmers today have a better sense of the weather. They have a better sense of pricing of their product. I don't think it's in full play yet to get that trading going that, while we are trying to create the food. If the food bill was such a big success, there wouldn't be a couple of million people sitting on the road every day doing dharna. So, we should be clear about these things, that we are not a country of, 1.2 billion idiots. So I just think that our business today can wake up 75 years later after independence and say, I have a conscience and I'm going to do something about making India successful. If India gets successful, I will get successful. That has to be the agenda. And it will be at conflict with capital. It will be an absolute conflict. So where will you create a social capital index? That's what you have to think of. There are only a few people who pay income tax, first of all, in this country. Okay, so we can complain about the tax, but the point is only few of us pay income tax. Most people don't because they're below the tax limit. They don't have a job. They don't have income. But you can create a social capital structure which allows investment into social things. I'll give you a simple example. You go into Norway, Finland, Denmark, any of the Scandinavian countries, and you look at the telecom towers which have been built many years ago. They are the same color of the community in which they stand. So if they are in a forest, they are green and brown. If they are in the city, they reflect the city structure. If they are around a lake, they are blue and color. They're almost invisible. Now that the telecom tower, you can say, is part of technology because it is, conveying the telecom signal. But it's a human mindset, which has said, let me adapt it to nature. Instead of these glaring monsters we have on various terraces of buildings and houses. I'm just saying that, where is the social capital structure that we are creating? There needs to be a social capital structure that if you contribute so much money to uplifting, take employment, I would say there has to be an incentive. Create employment opportunities, train them, skill them, create employment for 1 million people, and you get XYZ. That is when the country starts turning, not now. We have a lot to do. And that's actually very good that we have a lot to do because we have an ability to improve. I really think we have a fantastic constitution, and that is why we can, hold the moral compass the way we hold the moral compass, especially on things like data.
So that's an interesting aspect of how we look at the social consciousness of capitalism being rerouted into the Indian context. So actually, I think I have 10 more minutes as per the panel 1 hour time. So can I actually quickly have one more round of questions with all of you, with all of the panel's permission, right? I hope it's fine with all of you. So actually, I think a quick round of questions, one questions each. So for that purpose, let me actually come back to Professor Shahjahan. Sunil ji actually has pointed out the factor of how social conscious capitalism becomes important. And also talked about the fact that many times government policies, business, and the community's requirements are not always aligned. So with your expertise, especially in the people-centered development context, do you think that there is a common thread which can be drawn across the business interest as well as the community interest and the government policies?
First of all, I don't think there should be any conflict between business interest and community's interest. Then only we can think about a equal society. Now, it's a clear divide between business interest and the community's interest is something which is a disaster. Now, if you want to bring technology and use the demographic dividend, as I mentioned earlier, demographic dividend needs to be capitalized. And that capitalization of demographic dividend can make possible only if various technologies, including artificial intelligence and all those kind of technologies, unless and until it does not displace people from work. Because India has a huge population to provide services and economic development to the country. Unless and until we capitalize on that, we will end up in a disaster. So demographic dividend should not become a demographic disaster. That's one. The second thing which I would like to say is that we need to invest, including the private sector, need to invest more, whether it is through CSR or whatever way. Their social consciousness need to come through in investing in education and public health. And we have realized the need for this during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, it should not be a COVID-19 pandemic and several corporates are coming and doing something bits and pieces. But it has to be a mechanism. There has to be a mechanism where investment in education and health is the must. So whether bringing technology to reach education to the large number of people, bringing technology to ensure that people are getting healthcare on a sustained basis, because we currently the private sector engagement with healthcare is at the tertiary level predominantly, and that makes it a large number of people out of it, and the public healthcare system is in shambles all over the country and many parts of the developing world. So unless and until that is done, we will end up in a disaster. So the technology has to enable this process. And the third point I would like to mention is a universal social protection is something I work with the International Council on Social Welfare on this. The idea of universal social protection, it cannot be, there cannot be a deserving poor and an undeserving poor. You cannot have what you call a BPL survey done and then exclude certain section of the poor from this possibility of providing services. So how can technology ensure that there is a universal social protection, including maybe healthcare, education, everything, and even social security and everything? So my last point would be our investment has to be in education, public health, and also investment in skilling the people of India. And that has to, the technology can be used for using all those kind of human resources we have to the best benefit of the industry and the state and the market.
Right. So great points on the corporate social responsibility, how it should be rerouted and looked at from the perspective of public investments coming into sectors like education, health, especially where technology can be tapped in a better manner in those sectors. That's what Shah Jahan helped us to look at. Also, the interesting point of universal social protection. So I think that is something which is being talked about a lot in the international academic context. Also, largely how we actually look at the transition technology, job loss, as well as can we actually have a universal basic income kind of concept? Now, quickly moving forward to Dr. Usha, being a human rights scholar as well as activist, how do you actually see the technological changes that's happening? Quickly, what is a role human rights has to play in the entire context, and how internationally as well as nationally, we need to look at human rights as an important point when we look at technology change, both in the context of business as well as in the context of society.
Yeah, so I find that questions are important on their own. My answer might be somewhat, coming at it. It may not even really be an answer. I'm going to be saying some of the things that I want to say before you wind up. So one of those is that I think one of the factors that we need to recognize and be always aware of is how this current kind of technology, the current, this information technology and data-driven technology has produced new wealthy people. So if we look from the beginning of this century, we find that at least 5 to 6 of the top 10 slots have been taken over by those who are, who deal with technology. And it's always made me wonder about this, that they say everything is free, but they get richer and richer. So somewhere it would be helpful if we were able to unpack this. I think one of the significant effects which we need to be concerned about is something that Sunilji referred to about Azim Premji being good philanthropist. This is true. I agree with him. What worries me is that wealth is getting so unequal, and the technology world is creating this level of inequality, that it's coming back in the form of philanthropy, which is often not just philanthropy. So it is about wanting to build their businesses further. There are a lot of things that have been said about many of the major, technology people today. I mean, Bill Gates is constantly assaulted with questions of this kind. That you come back into it and the kind of power that it gives them. So it is, one person's imagination or one set of people's imagination controlling the rest of the world, because they have the power of money and the power of imagination that technology brings in. So this idea, for instance, of the vaccine certificate, I find most obnoxious, that all the world should be on a database. And you can only move if you're going to keep telling the database where you are, what you're doing. This kind of megalomaniacal ambitions are really strikingly something to be terrified about. So we do need to address it, not like it's just some kind of an innovation and, we just have to give our, put it up and put it on a database. It's not so simple. So I think this imagination becomes easy to spread when those who have that imagination have the money to talk to governments like they are equals, or perhaps not even equals, but more than equal, and where all kinds of institutions, international institutions, are controlled by them. So, whether it's ID4D or ID 2020 or any of these, you can pick up any of these. So philanthropy, I would really worry about. The second thing is we are looking not only to creating these systems, but also using them as a product which we export to other countries. So, if we don't assess what is happening to our own people when it is being brought, see, the tragedy about this past 10 years has been that the Indian people have been treated as a compliant population on whom full experiments can be done. And then it gets exported to other countries where they're going to face similar kind of problems, but it's marketed. In marketing, you don't tell them what's wrong with it. You tell them how brilliant it is. So, and if you don't hear civil society voices on this, and if there isn't enough work done by people on this, then it becomes a problem. Because then we are actually exporting a model which is going to create more inequality, more problems, deepening, the kind of divides that exist in other countries. So this responsibility, therefore, is not just what we do and what we are looking at around us, but it goes beyond that. And I'll end with this last one where, the fact is that these technologies are talking about human beings like they are less. There is disdain, close to contempt for the human being. And then we say that we are creating it for that human. And I think it's best illustrated in a document that came, quite recently, which was done by the Department of Defense in the UK and the German Department of Defense, which is on human augmentation. They say human beings are inadequate, and therefore we need to augment them. To do that, we need to know everything about them. You see, we don't know enough about them. For instance, we don't know how much water they drink, how much exercise they do, how well they sleep. Once we know all this, we can augment their capacities. So the one big tragedy that I see in the current and that is true about our about what's happening here too. Maybe we don't call it human augmentation, but we talk about it as people are corrupt, people are criminal, people will steal. So it's like a whole population is being looked at like it is made up of these characteristics. And it is the leadership and it is the technology companies that don't do any of these things. So it's the treatment that we are, and all of us are adopting it. When we say it, oh, it will make it more efficient. It will also mean no leakage. Then it will stop corruption. Oh, really? I mean, is that what we are seeing? And is that the kind of control that so this, the image of the human being that's being created, which is allowing to push this kind of technological experimentation on people, that is something that is going to stay with us for a while unless we are able to dislodge it. So this human augmentation, please go take a look at it. I think we need to do a lot of thinking on this kind of imagination, for want of a better word.
So I think that's actually asking us to look at the human augmentation based on the efficiency-driven mechanism of.
It's not only that. It's not only that. They're saying human beings have become less and less. So you don't have, you're useless on your own. There is actually a very interesting thing where there is a activist who's very upset with the way this data regime is going. But he says that, and it's, AI is now going to drive people out of work. He says, so labor has to reinvent itself. So what is labor going to be able to do? What is it going to be able to provide? That will work, that will provide them with some income with it. So he finds that with blockchain, the one thing that is needed in abundance, actually a lot of technology requires this in abundance, is energy. So he's actually saying the kind of work people will be doing is, you wear a leather, whatever, or, tiger skin on you and you lie on a thing and you emit energy. And that energy is what you're going to be able to say. Look at what we are reducing human beings to. Already, we've seen, when we look at the kind of work, when Professor Shah Jahan spoke about manual scavenging, it's true. And why is it that technology is not a priority there? And it's a priority everywhere else, because that's how we see human beings already. And then this is technology coming in and saying that actually, you know what, it's not just that much. We need to reconfigure you so that you can be worth existing. This is human augmentation. So let's just be clear that the imagination has gone way beyond anything that we would think about otherwise.
It's very interesting to look at this point of the dignity concept, which we actually talk about around human rights. How does actually reflect in the context of the new technological experimentation, as Dr. Usha has correctly pointed out.
I'll just say one little phrase with that. This is a complete disconnect with nature and as human beings as part of nature.
So I think, that's where I think it is actually hitting it. I think that part where we are actually what the role of human beings in the nature, and that's been also being disconnected in that context. And just adding to that is also the question of how labor force, especially already there's been questions of how the gig work economy, the labor force is being not treated with clear dignity. That's a question that actually comes into picture. So I think Dr. Usha also touched upon how future problems in that regard comes up. So I'll just quickly go to Sunilji. Just one last point from if you can share your insights on you had actually also pointed out this factor of rules and regulations. There's a gap already in the Indian context as well as global context also when we look at how we are actually tapping technology. What are your main pointers to look at from a public policy or from a regulatory as well as legal point? What are the points which we need to quickly look at in the Indian context as well as a global context also?
So two or three things. One is make it the onus of companies which propagate technology to go all the way down to the bottom of the country to people to whom it's not reached, and create pathways to enable them to live better. See, I have only one theme, okay, in all of this, which is we have one thing which is invisible. All of us on this call, I think we are 73 people odd. We all have a soul, and we've never seen our soul, and we will never see each other's soul. So my views, I hope technology does not start propagating soul sustainability, because the soul does not need technology, right? At the end of the day, it is bigger than technology. And to me, if you want to sustain the soul of India, you need to allow India to be free. You can be free where everybody gets the required dosage of daily food, education, sing music, practice poetry, whatever it is you do, some craft, some skill, build a freedom of speech. I think, where the mind is without fear needs to be played out all over again. There's a bigger reason for that, because today the mind is not without fear. And technology has destroyed what Rabindranath Tagore ji created. And if Indian industry can do something to bring that back, at least I will, in my own modest way, try my best. I think it's the biggest message we can send out over there. We need where the mind is without fear today more than any other day. Because I really believe very soon someone's going to say, like we spoke about the fact that, humans in labor needs to be reskilled. Somebody will say the soul needs to be re-architected. That will be the end of this universe, not just the planet.
So that's.
So I think actually business has failed on technology. Okay, as simple as that. It may have made a lot of innovations, may have improvised on many things, but it's constantly improvised on process. It has not improvised on equality.
Right. So Sunilji, that's interesting point of how the process is being only looked at by companies and not the equality part. So I think I'll just quickly conclude one point from all the common thread from all the speakers in the panel. One important point which I think Professor Shahjahan has highlighted is to look at social protection for the entire world community. Social protection, because the impact of technology creates the labor impact in adverse manner. So I think what is the social protection requirement that we need to look into? Then Dr. Usha obviously pointed out to the requirement of dignity from a human rights perspective. How does we need to actually clearly relook at a dignity concept due to the impact of technology in our lives? And Sunilji obviously talking about it should be the responsibility of companies to create a clear pathway of how they actually talk about being inclusive when they are rolling out the technology aspect as such. So I think I'm wrapping up our discussion because of also the brevity of time. I think we need to actually keep it within 1 hour. So we have overshot for 10 minutes. I think I hope that's fine because Dr. Shahjahan also have some travel immediately after the session. So I'm just handing over to the moderator, student moderator, the EPS members.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for the vibrant discussion from all the panelists. It was an excellent learning experience for me also to sit through and actually hear all three of you in this context. So thank you. I'll just hand over to the EPS members now.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Deva sir, and thank you to all the panelists for this amazing discussion. Do we have some time for Q&A? Can we take up some questions if the panelists are comfortable with it?
5 minutes. I have to go at 10:15.
I do. Quick questions. We need to leave in a few minutes' time. It's already, yeah.
I think I'm the only lotus eater, so I just eat for a while.
Yeah, sure.
Do we have any quick questions, guys? Yes, Madhur, you can proceed.
Thank you so much for such an insightful session. What stuck with me in the entire presentation was what Usha ma'am said, that data is being collected at a very granular level, and often the data is treated as a statistics and not something that is attributed to humans. So I just wanted to ask that from a consumer perspective, maybe the right to be forgotten or not be included in that sort of statistics, is that are there some movements globally or initiatives that are being taken up, or what has the progress been in here in India as well? So like what can be done to achieve that cause of right to be forgotten?
Do you want to take some questions and then we address them together? Or? Because I think since the other two panelists are leaving, if there are questions for them, I think that should be prioritized.
That's nice of you, Dr. Ramnath. Thank you.
Yes, Abhiraj, you can also pose your question.
Raju, I think you're on mute.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you're audible now.
Oh yeah, sorry for that. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for this insightful session. Sunil sir, I have a question. Actually, you were talking about a lot of impact that technology has created on inequality. But my question is, has there been something that technology has done to address this inequality in terms of income, in terms of opportunities, and in terms of environmental?
See, I think in a way, the easy access to redistribute money, right? Now, whether you talk of Jan Dhan and you talk of Aadhaar or whatever, they are pros and cons to this argument. Okay, so there's not a perfect argument, but I think the easy access to redistribute money, the easy way to know what's the money in your bank, the easy way for you to be able to transfer money is one very big positive for India, and it does come with security. The OTP does have a benefit. The one-time password is not in use in most countries. India is one of the few countries which actually uses this vigorously, right? It does protect people's money at the end of the day. It does protect the transaction. So yes, only a part of the country can do it. But for the part that can do it, I believe these are some of the things that technology has played a good role in. Even the vaccination, if you have to carry, if countries are going to impose that you carry the certificate, which we can understand. I mean, why should the vaccine certificate not have my photograph instead of somebody else's photograph? My picture is there on Aadhaar. Just replicate that, right? I ran into a problem last week when I was denied entry because they said you don't have a beard, because the picture on my thing had a beard. Then I had to pull out all other kind of evidence to say who I am, and then I had to Google search and show who this person is. So I'm just being very pragmatic here, right? I'm not scared. I believe in Rabindranath's poem. And I just believe that there have been some good things that have happened. But, you know, we are getting very happy with these few good things. I really worry. I think we have to go back. We had one prime minister, his name was Lal Bahadur Shastri, who really worried about the poor of India. And after that, there has not been a repeat act of Lal Bahadur Shastri. So we really need, it's not benevolence, it's a necessity. If businesses realize that the poorest person in this country will not be poor, there will be a light bulb, there will be water, etc., every single business will be successful. You know, so it's not, they are not doing a service. I think these companies, they write these grand AGM speeches, they should be fined for it, because those are just words. They're not actually able to do a lot over there, because capital will protect, will say declare dividend, don't do social work. I appreciate that. But till that's done, and if you look around the world, the Scandinavian countries are high tax countries. But once you stop working, you don't have to worry about your health and about your food and everything. The country takes care of you. In India, it's not the case. You know, so I think there are some good aspects, Abhiraj, but I think the glass is much less than half full.
Absolutely agreed, sir. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, I don't want to be rude, but I really have to go. Okay. So my apologies, Dr. Ramnathan and Professor and Professor Devra. Dev Prasad, to all students, thank you for hosting me and for giving me the opportunity to actually listen to Dr. Ramanathan and to Professor Shah Jahan. It's been my privilege. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for joining us despite your busy schedule.
No, not at all. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Sunil sir.
I think the question, any more questions? I think we can also allow Dr. Usha.
Can I leave to have
yeah, I think yes.
I think as well. Just would like to say one final point. There are a lot of micro initiatives on looking at how do we innovate, how do we take technology. Say, for example, there is a small initiative in Pune called Bottom of the Pyramid Energy Environmental Innovations. They look at how to generate energy in a much more sustainable way, in a micro way. It's not like grand technologies we need. We need such micro solutions. And the problems are at the micro level, and you need micro solutions. And the problem here is that we as a nation, as a country, we have not been promoting such innovations. We are looking at grand solutions of UID and grand solutions of such big things, which can be projected globally to put the name of India in somewhere. I don't know what that means, but we have not been focusing on such micro innovations, and we need to promote that. And industries and the management professionals have a great role to play in taking this forward. I'm sure all of you as students will commit yourself for such processes in generating much more innovations at the grassroots levels. We call it people-centered innovation or grassroots innovations. Such innovations need to be promoted. That's going to make a lot of difference in the way people are living in the kind of question of dignity, the question of human rights, question of personal liberty, all of those things we are talking about. I think we need to move in such kind of innovations which are going to make technology much more owned by the people and operated by the people. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Dr. Usha, it was wonderful to listen to you all the time. I've read a lot of literature by you, and it's been really pleasure being with you on the panel. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity for the entire team.
Actually, thanks for being a kindred soul.
Thank you. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I have to leave now. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for joining us this morning.
So should I just answer that one question that was there, and then we can...
Right. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
So that was a question on the right to be forgotten. Actually, it's called in some places the right to be forgotten. It's called the right to erasure in other places. And this is plainly coming because of all these engines which kind of produce and which never lets you forget. So as a lawyer, I can say that there are various places where we have learned that we should have erasure. So for instance, we have an Identification of Prisoners Act. And so, your fingerprints will be taken, they'll be kept on the record. But at the time that there's a sentence has been served and the person is leaving the prison, you erase that because that period is over. The point about the punishment is that there is a period and after that there is no further punishment. Now, what this does is to keep anything that happens in your life. And sometimes it's also, things that may not have happened, but have been written about as having happened, or your name might be affixed to an FIR somewhere as a witness, as whatever. Everything remains and you have no control over it. So the right to be forgotten is really one way by which we are saying that, the constructing our lives again and again. Our lives are, for very few people, is the life the same from start to finish. We keep we keep moving from stage to stage, and there are many things we leave behind. This technology doesn't allow you to leave anything behind. It kind of carries on with it being there throughout. The conflict that has come in this right to erasure is that it conflicts with the right to information, for instance, where they say, no. People who are in positions who have, of power or authority, who committed wrong, we should not allow erasure there, and nothing should be forgotten about that. So those are debates that happen within that. But I think the larger issue really is that companies are collecting all this data and regurgitating that data in various kinds of ways and taking away the right for people to move on. And so very often I, for instance, find this a problem that, and I think it happened briefly in this session too. I mean, when we were talking about it and the first thing went out, there will be something somewhere somebody would have said you did something and then you're identified as being that. And I'm like, no, that's not me. So in Tamil, we had a film called Naan Avanille, which is saying, he is not me, I am somebody else. So it's in that kind of context, it's like, who do I want to project myself as being? That is an integral part of the right to privacy. And that is taken away by saying, no, there are facts about you, and that is who you are. And those facts are facts that are held in various places. And you can't do anything about those facts because those facts are noticed, constructed, and attributed to you, and that's who you are. So the right to be forgotten and the right to erasure is still in the early stages of development. So all of you can actually contribute to that debate. It's a very, very interesting and, it's both intellectually stimulating and factually something that one can go and look at. What I'm going to say next is not a question that was asked, but I'm just picking up from what was asked of Sunilji. When we talk about inequality and what Professor Shah Jahan was also talking about, and I just think that it may be useful to just leave this thought with you. When the UID first started and they said, you can't get your social security pension unless you're going to link your UID with it and whatnot. And then people would say, why should these people haven't worked? When I get my pension, I've worked all my life in an organization and I get pension at the end of it. But we are making such a big deal of social security pension. People should work in this, this liberalized world. Everybody has to earn what they are in, what is an entitlement. So there's Shankarji from MKSS in Rajasthan, who one day really put it in perspective. He said, think about what it means for a poor person to have lived to reach 60. Can you imagine the amount of work that they have to do to just merely survive when the system is not helping them? So for many of us, I mean, I'm not in a job, but for many of us who are in jobs, we go to work, we have EL, PL, CL, ML, and then we have a whole host of other things. And then you can take voluntary retirement at a certain time. There's a whole host of things. So actually, if you see the number of hours that we work, it's not half as much as a poor person has to work just to survive. So that resentment that is caused where they say, okay, if you don't reveal yourself, if the poor don't reveal themselves to the system, and increasingly through technology, then you are not entitled to anything, because I want to see if you are a malingerer, if you are actually siphoning off things from various places. I need to verify you before I'm going to allow you any entitlement. I think that really needs to be put in a completely different perspective when you look from look from somewhere else. We need to shift our lens. Sunilji spoke about Rabindranath Tagore. I just want to mention Satyajit Ray. He made films. He, very often he was making films about the same thing that other people were making films about, except he shifted the camera to another place. And when you look at the world from there, it's a different world. So as management people, you're going to be looking at it through the lens of business. But while, at least as a student, because you need to know your world, you may need to shift your camera and keep it somewhere else and look at the world again, not just look at it through the lens of business. I'm sorry, that was completely, advice which is gratis. Nobody asked me for it. But in my age, in my old age, I think I should just say it because I don't know how long I'm going to be around to say it. So sorry about it.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Yes, sir, please.
No, I think no. I'm just asking, as in, so can we wind up? That's what just yeah. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That advice was, at least for me, it really was very inspirational and something that I do want to work on. And I think I speak for everyone on this panel and in this call. So with this, we come to an end of our panel discussion. Thank you so much for this extremely riveting discussion. We have a lot to think of and an inspiration to do a lot more. Thank you, Dr. Usha, for being with us this morning despite your busy schedule. Thank you, Professor Deva, for your time and for moderating this session. And thank you to everyone for attending this call. And we hope to see you for our next panel, which is at 2 o'clock. And it's on use of ICTs for development. We have a great panel lined up there as well. So thank you all for coming this morning, and we hope to see you there.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Usha ma'am.
Thank you so much, ma'am.